Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Should We Adopt IECC 2021 webinar today. We're kicking off our Wednesday webinar series. This meeting will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to all attendees. If there are any issues with audio, please write me in the chat. My name is Erica DeLello and I'm a project manager for NORESCO. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office with training materials created by Mozingo Code Group. We have been working with the Colorado Energy Office to provide trainings just like this one. Here we have a list of all the trainings that are offered in this series that will be provided over the next few months. There will be a link sent out in a follow-up email if you would like to register for another webinar. We are also offering tailored group trainings or technical assistance for jurisdictions that are updating I-codes and would like to discuss the technical assistance program for code adoption. In addition to the trainings, we've put together a code adoption toolkit that reviews the cost implications of changing code cycles, the benefits, and other compliance resources. Through that, we've also have a link to the troubleshooting guide that covers I-code conflicts, alignments, clarifications, and passive compliance. So be sure to check out those resources on the Colorado Energy Office's website. Throughout the webinar, we do want to encourage questions, so please use the Q&A function, and I'll let our presenter know at the end of the presentation. The chat window can also be used to chat among participants, but please use the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question. There is also the ability to request to raise your hand, and if you do that at the end of the presentation, I can unmute you and you can ask the presenter directly. Lastly, there will be a survey window that pops up following the webinar. Please take a minute to provide feedback so we can continue to improve on these webinars. Our presenter today is Shauna Mozingo. She is the president of Mozingo Code Group, as well as being a plans analyst and inspector for jurisdictions. Over the past 8 years, she has provided code adoption assistance and training to code officials, builders, energy raters, and designers. She is a past president of the IECC Colorado chapter and has served on the IECC code development and correlation committees for the 2018 and 2021 code cycles. And I think she's even starting on 2024 already. So with that, I'll let Shauna take it from here. Shauna, you're still muted, just so you know.
There we go. All right, sorry about that. Thanks a lot. It's exciting to be back to the webinar series. I think that the last webinar series we had in the spring through the Energy Office had COVID, so I didn't get to present, and so it's been a while. I'm excited to be back. All right, so today we're going to talk about the 2021 IECC. I know on this slide I have the 18 picture, but that's because the 2021 hasn't been published yet, so we don't 100% sure what it'll look like. But we're just going to look through some of the progression of the codes and which one we should adopt based on goals and things. So let's just get started. I think that the first thing that we really have to look at are what are our goals. So in order to discuss which code we should adopt, I think we really have to understand what a jurisdiction's goals are. Many jurisdictions have different abilities, capabilities, resources, and goals. So we have to adopt what's in line with what you can do, or what you're willing to do, or how you want to stretch your comfort zones and your boundaries. So what is it that you're willing to do? It's not fair to future building owners and occupants to adopt a code that you really have no intention of enforcing because they think they're getting something maybe that they're not. So you really want to put some thought into what code you adopt. While you can have amendments at a local level, you have to also remember with the energy code that there are some laws that say you can't make it less restrictive. So you really want to put in a lot of thought into all of this. Let's look at some different goals. So is it your goal to provide as many options as possible? Or I have had jurisdictions that their goal is to restrict options. Don't recommend that all the time, but I get it. You know, I've seen people say, well, I don't understand ASHRAE 90.1, for instance. I don't have time to learn ASHRAE 90.1, so we're just not going to offer that. It's unfortunate, but it's understandable. So you have to look at what your options are. So the newer codes, a lot of times we bring in more requirements, but we also bring in more options. So that's nice. Is your goal less cost? Well, what is that? That's going to be hard to adopt a newer code with a lot less cost, but we can talk about that in a minute because there are some cost-saving proposals that made it into the code that can lower the cost. And I think that especially builders are going to be surprised with some of that. Is your goal less enforcement? Is there a code addition that would require less work from your jurisdiction? Or more specifically, are there paths within the code that would allow less oversight from your jurisdiction because you have too much to do or you don't have enough staff? Or, you know, the 2015 and the 2000 through the 2021 really have a lot more paths than the 9 and the 12 did. And so those newer paths rely on third parties, which takes some stuff out of the building department's hands, which some people like that, and puts it more into that third party, which brings us to that kind of next goal. Do you want a code that involves more third party involvement? Sometimes you just don't have the staff or time to enforce the energy code, so you rely on a version of the code that has more allowances for third party. And when you get to the 2018 and 21, there's a lot more wording incorporated into those regarding third-party agencies and what is required of them for reports and involvement. So it does address that, realizing that more and more people are using them. Is your goal to save more energy? Of course, the latest codes will save the most energy, so it makes sense to be on the latest version of the energy codes for energy savings. That doesn't mean that the older versions don't save energy, but we have, you know, we've just kind of always moved forward, even if it's by 1 or 2% according to DOE analysis. So the newer the code, the more energy savings. Maybe your goal is, I just need a code that's easier to use. I think we all want that. That is a tough one, and it depends on who you talk to and what your idea of easier. Is it easier to construct? Is it easier to measure savings? Is it easier to do plan review or inspection? Or is it easier because it provides more options, so it's cheaper to build to? It's more flexible. Just personally, the 2012, I think, is probably one of the hardest to do right now, just because we had to make this big, huge jump, and so we just kind of threw a lot of stuff at the code to make the jump that we needed to make. And so we spent the last couple of code cycles, the 15 and 18 especially, really trying to work those things out. The more we used, the more we worked with those provisions, the more we were able to work them out, refine the wording, provide more options to make it doable. And so if you're planning to move forward and you're thinking, well, I'll just go to the 12, there's a couple of reasons. I would say 15, 18, or 21 is one, state regulation about the 12 being you need to be on one of the most 3 recent versions, if you're in Colorado anyway. But 2, because 12, I think it was harder than the 15, the 18, and well, the 21 is still to be seen. We haven't have it fully published, but we know what's in there. And so if you're going to make a jump, I would go at least to the minimum to the 15, but we're going to talk why the 18 and 21 are probably your better bets. So maybe your goal is net zero. We have a lot of jurisdictions that are really trying to do right by the planet and do right by their communities and get to where we're not using any energy. And so definitely with those goals of moving forward to reach that net energy, you definitely want to adopt the 2021 and keep moving forward with all the future additions. I mean, that's definitely what you would want to do. So, so we focus on the goals. Then we have to, goals aside, we do have to think about the process that we go to adopt the codes and who's involved, and more so who's truly actively involved and really vocal, right? Some jurisdictions write their codes under, behind the scenes and then just publish them and say, okay, this is the code we're on, because it's easier to do that way. But most jurisdictions get some involvement from the community, maybe try to make it a public process, because realizing that the more input we get right now and the more involvement we get now and the more buy-in we get now as we're writing it, and when we hear those arguments now, the less complaints we have going to city council after it's already adopted and we're trying to enforce it. And so who's involved in that process? If the builders are involved, well, a lot of times they're the most vocal. So if you have a jurisdiction where the builders rule the roost, then a lot of times I find that those builders are wanting you to go to an older version of the code just because they don't like change. And the idea is that a newer code will cost more, or it'll just be harder. And so it really takes some education and some communication to help them to see that maybe the newer codes provide more options, and maybe they really aren't harder to go to, and they really aren't as expensive to go to. And so I find a lot of times, once I've talked to the builders who just want their jurisdictions to go to 12, for instance, if you're going to move forward, just go to 12 or even the 15. And once you start going through and showing, look at this option for ducts that in conditioned space, or look at these, and you show them all of the options, that they do think that the 18 at a minimum is easier to go to and probably cheaper because of all of the options. So it does take some convincing. The automatic response is to not move forward. And so it does take some convincing. Now, designers aren't really against moving forward usually. They just need to know what you want from them. The largest battle with designers is the amount of different amendments from all the different jurisdictions. So nobody does the same thing, and they're just having to design a completely different building everywhere they go. And so it's nice to involve them in the process so that you can understand the battles that they face. Building owners. Now, owners are rarely get involved in the process, which is completely unfortunate, because that's where we could see the most change, truly. If building owners truly knew what to expect from their buildings and the codes, and they insisted on that from their jurisdictions, then we'd see real change, because they would be more vocal than the builders or designers, because they are the bottom line. They're the ones who have to pay those energy bills. So if they knew what to expect and they demanded it, then we would see real change, because everybody would really have to step up their game. I think that education to building owners could really change how codes got used. Is city council involved? Some city councils just do whatever the building department recommends because they're the experts in that area, and they just do. And some of them have really active councils. So I see that council members change all the time, and different members have different agendas. So I speak to a lot of city councils on behalf of jurisdictions that are trying to move forward. And usually there's a mix of people that don't increase costs for construction, or we need to get to net zero, or anywhere in between. Once in a while you get a majority council who agrees one way or another, and they really drive the adoption. So I think it's really good to research your city council members and what their goals are and their belief systems are, or what their agendas are, so that you really can save some time while you're doing your amendments, because the last thing you want to do is write up this whole huge package and have it denied and have to start over. So it does do some good. The Colorado Energy Office Energy Code funding for technical assistance does allow us to help by coming to speak to your city council. So if you ever need that assistance, just let us know. Building department staff, right? So getting buy-in from your staff that has to enforce the code is essential. Many don't want to change, or they're set on an older code. I worked with some inspectors who still make their calls based on the 97 Uniform Building Code, right? Because that was their favorite code, or they liked it better. And so they call what's in that code, and they only call what's in the newer code if they get challenged by somebody. And so it's really trying to get education involvement from your staff that's key to true enforcement. If you just adopt and tell them that you adopted a new code without giving them training, you're likely going to get calls based on whatever was the last training that they received. So training for your building staff and buy-in from your, get them involved. I've worked at jurisdictions where they assigned us each sections of the code or each codes, and we had to come to staff meetings with our ideas of what we needed to change. We had buy-in. It was our code, and there was more likely that we were going to enforce it. What about sustainability departments, right? So many jurisdictions have sustainability departments who would love for you to adopt the latest versions of the code, and usually involved in writing amendments that go beyond just energy to encompass more green strategies or sustainable design. Their goals are to get to net zero and to truly be responsible to the planet and the communities. But the one thing that I've noticed is that it's rare, maybe not, it's getting better, but it's still kind of rare that the sustainability department and the building departments really communicate. And so the building department is usually the one who gets to enforce the code, so it's really important that there's communication there and that the goals are similar and that you're talking about what people can really do and not just writing something on paper that'll never get enforced. So keeping that in mind as you move forward, it can be done. I mean, I have examples of like Lafayette or City and County of Denver and quite a few others who do work together, where they communicate and they write things that each other know about and they agree upon, and they work out who's going to enforce it and they share the responsibilities. So it can be done, but it's just something to think about. And do you have consultants involved, right? Do you have consultants involved in the process, and what are their beliefs? Do they just help out and do whatever you ask them to do, or do they try to convince you one way or another on what you're doing? Or sometimes I have jurisdictions, they just want me to write their whole thing and do whatever everybody around them is doing and make it consistent with whatever others are doing because they don't have time to do it. And then there's others who just want, just come in. We'll tell you what we want to write, but could you help us write it? Or so it just depends on what's going on around you. There's all kinds of people involved. So between your goals and who's involved, that really is part of the drive of how you move forward, but then there's always cost, right? Cost of construction. And how is it going to cost? How much more is it going to cost me to build from the 15 to the 18 to the 21? We're going to get into that in a minute. What about the cost of energy? The cost of energy has to be considered, right? What is Excel charging me? Or maybe I have some jurisdictions who say, okay, well, the cost of energy is definitely higher in the winter. So we're going to look at code requirements that really would help us save money in those winter months. Maybe the insulation is more key than we're not going to worry so much about the air conditioning, or we're going to worry more about this over here. And so cost of energy does drive some people's choices. Savings in energy. What's the return on investment? Are the savings more beneficial than the cost? Are you, aren't all savings beneficial? Some people would say, it depends on who you ask. If it takes 100 years to save enough to pay back the investment, is it worth it? Some say the return on investment shouldn't be longer than the mortgage of the building, like 30 years. And some people say, well, the return on investment shouldn't be more than the lifespan of the building, which could be 100 years, could be more with the way we have new construction. So what are your beliefs there? It's hard to say what that return on investment period should be, but definitely saving energy is important. What are the costs of adoption? There are true costs there, right? So training, books, maybe consultants, staff time to research and make proposals, go into council meetings, all of that. That's all. There's costs for that. Who pays for that? How often should I go? Should I adopt every cycle, or should I split it up and only go every other cycle? Those decisions are a lot of times based on cost of adoption and the time I have for my staff. Cost to implement. Are there new tools or resources that we are going to need? Do we need to host some public meetings? Those are going to cost maybe. Or do you need to update your website or update handouts or submittal guidelines? But there are costs that have to be considered. So these are all things that drive us forward. Cost savings determination, the Department of Energy determines a lot of times. They evaluate all of the different code additions to make sure that we're moving forward and not rolling back the codes. So if you go to energycodes.gov, you'll see a lot of, what does it cost to move forward, and what are the savings if we move forward from one addition to the next. And so those are good things. They do it to ASHRAE 90.1, they do it to the IECC. And so you'll be able to go in there and really see how they've determined it, what their methodology is that they use, and how they move forward. So they have it on all the different codes. But there's also National Association of Home Builders. They do a cost analysis. Of course, they're going to try to tell their builders how much it's going to cost to go to newer codes, to all of them, not just energy. But they do look at energy codes, and they publish their methodology and their costs and things. So it's good to go to nahb.org and look at some of their costs. If I'm looking, like they do analysis, this is an example of like what is the cost increase from the 9 to the 12 for multifamily. And I'm going to bring this up. I know this is an older version, but I have a method to my madness. This is 2009 to 2012 for multifamily buildings. So if you look down here in climate zone 5, most of them depend on the type of siding, on how much it's going to cost to increase for the newer code. And so from 9 to 12, the increase in cost in climate zone 5, didn't matter which siding, was between $530 to $632, which I think climate zone 5 had it the best, because if you look at some of these other costs in other climate zones, they were considerably higher. But so they show you their costs, and then they put out an analysis of the whole code based on different climate zones and how much the cost is to increase from, let's look at this, for just a single family home from the 2012, they're saying they can go up as high as $8,000 in climate zone 3, but as low as $4,000 in climate zone 2, and the average cost increased $7,000 for a new home, but that's based on all codes, not just energy. But so let's look at their 18 analysis. So see, if you look at the NAHB put out a cost study analysis on their 2018 IRC, not just energy, but their whole IRC, they're saying that it's actually cheaper to build to the newer codes, right? Some, because I like this report, and I have a copy of it if anybody wants it, and it's also on the state's website, the toolkit. So it gives you a proposal, the code change proposals that went in and what they were about and how they either saved money or cost money. And so, well, you could reduce the amount of wood that's in your headers. It only requires 1 or 2 of your king stud. So, you've reduced the amount of wood. So in climate zone 5, it was 0 or a cost savings of $90 to build to the 18 for the wood, right? And then you look here, masonry, veneer, well, that proposal could cost you as much as $325 or save you as much as $73, depending on what you decided to do. And so it just goes through and tells you, yeah, the new lighting requirement's going to cost about $8. But the duct sealing proposal that they got in there that doesn't require you to seal your longitudinal seams, that's going to save you between almost $350 and $470. So ultimately, when you look at all of the proposals, the total to the consumer for climate zone 5, the most it's going to cost, $70, but you could save as much as $548. You're in the red. The cost is cheaper. There's so many more options. NHB is very involved. They're always involved in the code change process, but they got a lot of things in there that say, okay, well, here your ducts can be it can be considered to be in conditioned space. If you bury them and you do this, well, that's a huge credit if you're going performance to have your ducts in the conditioned space. So there's a lot more options that came in that make it cheaper to build to the 18, and this is based on the National Association of Home Builders themselves. So that's something that I love to show jurisdictions. Let's look at some of those options. So some people call them requirements, I call them options, right? It's all perspective. So we want to look at some of these, for commercial and residential, not just the systems, but the options also in compliance paths, because it's all the options put together that get us the decisions on where we should go. So first, let's just take a look residentially. This is the 2009 table overlaid with the 2018 requirements. So look at climate zone 5. The only thing that changed in 9, 12, 15, 18, so 4 code cycles, was a window went from 0.35 to 0.30, which is what you can buy off the shelf anyway. And the insulation in the attic, prescriptively, went from R38 to R49, but it did that early on. So even if you adopted the 12, you're going to get this. So there's not been, and then your basement wall insulation went from 1013 to 1519. So that's the only changes, and those occurred pretty early on. Not many of these changes occurred in the 18. So if you were just looking at this alone, if you're going to go to the 12, you might as well go to the 18. The changes aren't much different. So it's just something to think about. But let's look at what changed in the 2021, right? So as a minor, one change is just that people didn't like the word mandatory, so they changed to put all of those items that used to say mandatory next to them, don't say anything. They're just required if you go prescriptively or with res check or something. It's when you get into performance paths that certain things are allowed to be traded and certain are not. So that's where they moved everything. So it's either tradable or it's not tradable. And so that's a little bit of a change. Then you have this, there is a new section. Some people say it didn't make it in there, but I just verified today it did. The additional efficiency package option, if you're familiar with commercial buildings where you had C406, where you had an additional efficiency package option, that made it into the code for residential. It's you do everything that the code says based on the path, and then you also have to choose an additional package option in here. And so it's just trying to get a little bit more efficiency, but giving you the option of how you get there. In the slab insulation requirements for climate zone 3 through 5 were revised. So in climate zone 5, it just said instead of going like the R10 for 2 feet, it's now for 4 feet. So that's a requirement in the 2021. I'm not going to go through every single requirement because we have different individual webinars coming up that are going to cover mechanical or envelope or whatever. So I'm just kind of trying to, give you an idea if you're trying to decide between 15, 18, 21, what some of those changes are on a high level. Footnote G that said, if you got a floor and you can't fit R30 in it, you could drop down to R19 in certain instances. That footnote did go away, so you're only allowed to drop down from an R30 if you use a tradable path like res check or simulated performance or ERI. And then the wall insulation requirements were revised for all the climate zones, so that now they all have a cavity only option, a continuous only option, and then most will also have at least one cavity plus continuous. So for climate zone 5, the prescriptive option will be an R20 plus 5, an R13 plus 10, or an R10 0 plus 15. So those are your options for climate zone 5. And then the ceiling insulation did go up in 2021, so you're going to see a requirement from to R60, from R49 to R60 in climate in the 2021. And then the 2021 also adds an option. It's just an option. So some of these you're going to say are requirements. Some of them are just adding more options. So as an option for cavity plus continuous insulation for basements and crawl spaces, where it used to just be cavity only or continuous only. They wanted to get more energy efficiency, but again, sticking with the theme of providing as many options as possible. There was a removement for structural sheathing. This is one where they always had this thing, if you have structural sheathing that you're required to have for structural, then in those instances you could drop down that continuous insulation on the outside so that you kept an even finish, so that for your finished materials. But now that's gone away. So if you need to drop down that exterior continuous insulation, you'll have to use a trade-off path to do so. So I haven't gone away for sure. It's just saying use a path to do it. You can't do it prescriptively. Fenestration, the U factor requirements in the climate zones has dropped. So in climate zone 5, your U factor has dropped, but also there's also been these exceptions that have got brought back in to put in a higher U factor in some of these climate zones, like that have that are at higher elevations, because you know that once you bring some of those windows over their high elevation, they lose the gases and things in them that give them their low U factor. So there's some exceptions if you're over 4,000 feet in elevation. So basically all of us in Denver, you can have a higher U factor, although you're still going to be able to buy those low U factor ones right off the shelf. It's really when you get in, you go over to Aspen and things like that, that you start running into that. And then the air leakage requirements. So there's an exception added to the air leakage testing section that to address testing individual dwelling units to an option of 0.30 CFM per square foot instead of just an ACH 50. So this allows us, so a lot of times those smaller houses or those apartments will be able to do a CFM per square foot instead of just an ACH 50, which is great, gives you a more even playing field. And the requirement is also changed to say that testing is mandatory, but the amount of leakage is prescriptive, meaning it can be traded off. And then it adds finally a 0.0 after the ACH. So if it says 3 ACH, it's actually 3.0, because there was confusion that is 3 ACH, do I round up, do I round down? What if it's 3.2? That's over 3 ACH. It's just clarifying that they meant 3.0. So the 0.0 was put on all of those. All right, commercial envelope, I just show this to show you some of the changes. So from 9 to 12, anything in black is what changed from the 9 to the 12. And so anything in green didn't change. So you'll see that a lot of your changes came in the 2009, from the 2009 to the 12. Right, we added slab edge protection where there wasn't any. We increased the insulation just about everywhere. The only place we didn't was below grade walls and floors. Your glazing changed, your window to wall area changed, your area requirements changed from the 9 to the 12. So a lot of changes there. When you look at the 12 to the 15, look at all of this that didn't change. Right? We increase the stringency of requirements for skylights, like in those large open spaces where you have to have skylights prescriptively. Then that changed to, it went from it's only in buildings over 10,000 square feet to being in buildings over 20 or spaces over 2,500 square feet. So that was a change. Brought in the requirement that if you use radiant panels on your walls or your ceiling, that you put insulation behind them. And then the requirement for the rooms containing fuel burning appliances. So everything else pretty much stayed the same. Oh, and roofing insulation went from R25 to R30. And then when you go from the 15 to the 18, you can see again, hardly any change in those prescriptive tables. You know, they made some clarification for garage doors because they weren't really covered great to begin with, and then they tightened down the U factor and solar heating, or the solar heating of windows. But other than that, not a lot of change. And again, we're talking about climate zone 5. So it is good to see if you're going to move forward and you're going to go to 12, you might as well just keep going because there's not a lot of reason to stay on that 12. 2018 to 21, no roof insulation changes, but just about everything else changes. So your above grade walls change to, you know, R13 plus 7.5 to R13 plus 10. Wood walls gives you some different options. Below grade walls change for group R. A lot of them just change for group R to kind of keep in line with what's in the residential provisions. But some change for all buildings. So you can see that there are quite a few changes. Here's one. I'm not going to get into them because we have other webinars to discuss them, but you know, blower door testing in climate zone 5, blower door testing required for most commercial buildings. Never been in there before, but it is, except for buildings between 5,000 and 50,000 square feet. So smaller buildings and really large buildings in our climate zone might require a blower door test. Then there's also a requirement for envelope verification, right? Make sure that that air barrier is intact and it's working and it's continuous. So you have to have that verified by somebody and inspected by somebody. So there are those requirements that did come in. If you have, like, say a restaurant that they like to use those big garage doors that open up and close, there's a requirement in there that say, okay, you can use those, but they need to interlock with your mechanical system so that you don't have your air conditioner blowing 100 miles an hour to keep the space cold while you have all these, you know, big, huge openings open. So there's some different things that definitely changed in 2021. When it comes to mechanical changes for commercial, you know, 2009 to 2012, of course, you had equipment efficiency. They always increase. Load calculations, basically saying the only real change there was that you can't put in a piece of equipment over the calculated load. You have to meet the load. You can't oversize. Commissioning came in within those cycles and has been, fixed as we go, and so that's good. Economizers, it's changed a couple times, but it's gone back to where it was. So there's, almost no change other than they've tightened it up. The nice thing about the 18 that I really like is that they redid that whole mechanical section so that it's really in order. You used to have to say, if you wanted to find the requirements for economizers, you had to go all over the place. Now it's all in one nice little section, so that's good. This capable versus configured language changed in the 2018. So it used to say in the 15 and before, the thermostats or the controls had to be capable of doing something, and now it says they have to be configured to do it. Not just capable, they actually have to do it, right? And so that came in. In 18 brought in, making sure that those vestibules aren't heated and cooled to the full amount of the building, but there's some limits on those. They weren't supposed to be heated and cooled to begin with, but realizing that they put some limits. And so guest rooms, there's all kinds of changes that come in. We can go through the whole mechanical. But some of the bigger ones, guest rooms, there were some requirements in the 18 that the guest rooms have to be configured to if nobody's in the rooms, that the system isn't going as much as it is if people are in the rooms. So those all of these things came in between the 9 and the 18. So what if we're looking at the 2021? There are some new requirements, but there's also some options like data centers, getting some exceptions for data centers in there, and things, putting a new section just for data centers so that they don't require the same as everything else, and they can you can choose to just comply with ASHRAE 90.4 for those, with a couple of exceptions. Brings in fault detection diagnostic sections so that buildings that have serve more than 100,000 square feet of space, conditioned floor area have to have fault detection systems to monitor those systems and make sure we identify any faults that are going on. So of course, the HVAC system efficiencies, instead of having all of those tables that change all of the time, plus ASHRAE 90.1 has tables, they just copied and pasted the ASHRAE 90.1 tables in there so that everybody's on the same page. So those are some nice things. There's all kinds of, the heat pumps, specific times when you can limit supplemental heat operation, clarifications on auto start systems and things like that. So there are some things in there. There's some things maybe that we should know about that, I'm sure that will get covered, I think, by Kevin when he does his mechanical, I believe it's Kevin, that there are some things in there that you probably should be aware of, like demand control ventilation. When we get down to demand control ventilation, it added some that all single zone systems required to comply with any of the economizer provisions have to meet also the demand control provisions. So that's in there. Parking garage ventilation controls clarified that contamination sensing devices is really now a carbon monoxide detector applied in conjunction with a nitrogen dioxide detector. Say that 3 times real fast. So there's some different things in there that definitely got clarified and brought in, some of it for safety reasons, some of it for efficiency reasons. So just making sure that you know about those. Large diameter ceiling fans, I thought that was interesting, that large diameter ceiling fans has a requirement. So if you have a fan that's got 7 feet or larger in diameter, it has to be tested and labeled. And then some heat recovery requirements for healthcare facilities. So as we're just, trying to make it a little bit more specific so that it isn't just so general that it applies to everything, really honing it in so that it only applies where it really makes sense to apply. Residentially, we started with the requirement for manual J, went to manual D and S. That hasn't changed in a while. Some things that changed over the time was, some options getting brought in. Residentially, this option for buried ducts is huge. It's how do I deal with condensation in my attic, but also how do I deal with air leakage through my ducts in the attic? How do I give myself a credit if I really insulate those ducts really good and bury them in the insulation instead of just sitting them on top of the insulation? And how do I consider my ducts? When can I consider them to be inside the envelope and outside the envelope? So there's some really great changes that came in 15 and 18, more so the 18 when it came to options for ducts and reducing the cost of construction for builders, even if they went prescriptively, but more so if they chose the performance approach and getting those credits. The 2021 really, it just redefined that duct when we call them inside the envelope, when they're outside, and especially within floor cavities and walls, how to insulate them, what to do for ducts outside the envelope, and things like that. So one thing that I wanted to just point out in the 2021 is there's a requirement added by removing an exception to mandate that all ducts are tested. So from the 9 to the 18, it was ducts outside conditioned space. If your duct was inside conditioned space, you didn't have to test it. And because that exception got removed, then it applies to all ducts. So those inside the envelope, they can leak more than if they're outside the envelope, but they still have to be tested. Except duct serving ventilation systems, they're not required to be tested. Let's see. There's a section on there for water heating equipment that's added, and that specifies with different kinds of water heater types as well as efficiencies. It's going to be hard to know how much of that is really going in and how much isn't, because, a lot of people know that these have been under appeal. So ICC still making their determination on some of this, but just some things to be aware of. Commercial water heating, the biggest change was in 2015 when they said you have to, put some thought into your hot water design system, and you either don't have your fixture very far from its source or don't allow very much water through the pipe. The only real change in that in 2021 came in actually another option by allowing you to use the table in the IPC instead of in the energy code. So it did allow for that. There are some changes to pools and spas and covers in there, so that I think the change in the 2021 was that it covers if more than 70% of the energy for heating is from a heat pump or solar energy source, that you didn't have to do it. Now it's, it used to be 75%, now it's 70%. You don't have to have a cover if you're doing that. So there are some changes there, but a lot, like I said, more options. Power and lighting has been fun to deal with along the way. It's always changing. The efficiencies are changing. The watts per square foot are always changing because the technology is always changing, right? Occupancy sensor requirements are always changing. We had our regular occupancy sensors, they had to shut off within 30 minutes. Then it became 20 minutes. And then there was like, oh, well, we have, these big designs for open office spaces. So how do we deal with them there? And so there's some different changes now with COVID. I don't know that we're going to have those big open office spaces. Are we going to go back to closed office spaces? I don't know what's going to happen there. But there have been some changes there on when occupancy sensors are required, specifically like warehouse storage areas, open office plans, corridors. So there are some definite changes coming in 2021. But again, basically, a lot of it is on technology changes. Daylight responsive controls came in, and they just keep getting redefined. In 2021, there's some requirements in there to bring it more in line with what's in ASHRAE by adding some additional secondary spaces, secondary side-lit zones, secondary zones. So you're looking at more space there. So there are some different changes. The separate metering requirements for electricity came in early on in the 12, so it doesn't matter if you, that's in there for commercial buildings. Commercial R2 occupancies need separate meters. So there are some stuff in there. New to the 2021, yeah, there's some, maybe some looking at a new section for daylight zones and atriums. There's some further clarification for parking garages. There's some, it's more looking at lowering the watts per square foot and dealing with technology and getting the lights to shut off when they don't need to be on, and making sure that people are not going to shut off the lights, so we need to figure out how to do it for them. And so it's a lot of that in there. Residential lighting, it's changed over the year. It used to be 50% of the permanently installed lights and permanently installed fixtures have to be high efficacy. Then it went to 75. Now it's at 90. It does revise the definition for high efficacy, so that is in there. It brought in, there is a new section in 2021 that will require either a dimmer, occupancy sensor, or other control that's built into the fixture to be installed in all the lighting. But it does provide exceptions for like bathrooms and halls and exterior lighting and stuff like that. So there are more control requirements coming in residentially that didn't used to be there. The last couple of things I want to talk about are the changes to C406. Those are the additional efficiency packages options in commercial, where you had to pick one. In 2012, it came into the code. You had to pick one of these three options on top of what was already required. Then in 15, they added 6 options. In the 18, there were 8 options. Now in the 2021, it will be a point system. So you basically, to to meet the requirements, new buildings have to achieve a total of 10 credits from different tables. So you get to pick, maybe you can mix and match. There's some mechanical, some lighting, there's just all kinds of more efficient cooling, you know, just different things based on climate zones. So, you know, if you're in climate zone 8, you're not going to get as many credits for cooling as maybe Florida does. You might get better, you know, more credits for high efficiency heating equipment or something. So it's based on climate zone. So you can look for that. But also in the 2021, the additional efficiency package options comes into residential. So it looks like the old C406 that had the options, it'll include an option for like better total UA, U factor for area, like a res check. So 5% better res check, high efficient mechanical equipment, more efficient water heating system, more efficient duct system, or better air sealing and ventilation combination, which is great that if you're going to crank down the air sealing, you bring in better ventilation. So those are some requirements. The existing buildings chapter came into the 2015. We keep, you know, trying to make the wording better in each cycle, so that's nice. Some of the wording that used to be in the existing buildings chapter now made it into chapter 1 that makes it a required for all buildings instead of just existing buildings, and that's things like documentation and what you have to provide to the owner at the end, and some of those reports. So 2021, well, they've actually, the Solar Ready has been in some of the previous versions, but they've now been brought to match. So there's a Solar Ready in both residential and commercial if you want to do that. But there's also net zero options as an appendix in the 2021, how to get to net zero using the code. And so there is a path in the appendix provisions. And then you have your paths of compliance. Commercially didn't really change. You still have ASHRAE 90.1. You still have your prescriptive path, which also meant ComCheck, component performance alternative, performance, and then of course you could go above code. So those paths haven't really changed. The amount of paths, some of the wording within the paths have changed, but those paths haven't changed. The paths of compliance residentially, we did add in the 2015 this energy rating index, the ERI path. So you did get an additional path of compliance. So you have more to choose from, more options residentially. In the 2021, it just cranks that down a little bit, you know, determining how much credit you get when you actually add solar onto a building and those kinds of things that get thought about. But I believe Robbie's going to talk about those in his webinar. One thing I want to mention is the EV requirements that got brought in under the 2021. They were brought in both commercially and residentially. I will say that they've gone through the appeals process. People were fighting them because they said, you know, well, what does electric vehicle charging have to do with conserving energy of the building? And so it got fought. It went through the appeals process. It's gone to the board of directors at IECC. The last I understood, they were considering not putting these in the code. They were going to maybe see if they should go into the green code or something because it didn't save energy of the building. However, I have a lot of jurisdictions asking me for the EV requirements. They want to add them into their sustainability plans right now. So we've been providing that language. It's still in there. It's good language. So we've been providing that to a lot of people. We are going to talk about it way more in depth on our October 28th webinar. I'm going to bring in some people to talk about electric vehicle charging language, how to put it in your code even if it's not in the code, and what the state is doing to provide incentives and assistance on some of that. So be sure to tune in for that webinar. There was some electrification. A lot of jurisdictions wanted to go to electrification, electric readiness, and have asked for that language. We've been adding the 2021 language. Again, it might be one of those things. Some of it might not get into the code based on the appeals. Don't have full determination on that yet. But we will talk about that on that October 28th webinar. That's just saying, you know, when you install a fuel burning appliance, you should also install an outlet in the right space that's needed to make those conversions and things, and trying to get people ready for if they want to go all electric, that they at least have that option to do so. All right, so basically, real quick in summary, it's just really, when you're looking at that 2021, the biggest jump was from the 9 to the 12. There's a jump to the 2021 for sure. But I have people that say, man, my energy code is just going too far. And I have others who say, man, I cannot use the energy code to get me to my goals. I have to make up something because the energy code will never get me there. And so you have every opinion everywhere in between. So yeah, there's a big jump to the 2021, but a lot of people have been asking for it. The biggest jump, I think, was from the 9 to the 12. So if you're thinking of going to the 12, you might as well just go that 18. 12 was complicated. 2015 brought in options and tried to fix things, but the 2018 brought even more options, or reorganized, made it easier to read, and actually lowered the cost if you look at some of the home builders reports. The 2021 has some more options and more efficiency, as well as non-tradable requirements instead of mandatory, non-mandatory. So the real questions are, what are your goals? What do you want to do? What are your capabilities? Who's going to be involved? What are your resources? And then the other question is, how can we help you? Right? The state is offering code adoption assistance, training. What do you need from us? How can we help you? Those are the questions. So I'm going to turn it over now to Erica so that we can answer some questions.
Thanks, Shauna. That was great. That was a really good overview of all of the changes that we've had throughout the years in addition to 2021. So while we wait for some questions to come in, feel free to put any questions in the question and answer box, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask the question directly. Either way works. In the meantime, while we wait for some questions, I did want to highlight next week's webinar is on the administration of energy efficiency provisions of the codes. So this webinar is going to take us a little bit back to the basics, showing us how to administer an energy code, looking at the layout of the code, how it was intended to be used, and how it fits in with all of the other codes as well. So definitely tune in with us next week as well. It does look like we've got some questions coming in. So Shauna, are you seeing any changes with code enforcement for the better? Any field verifications for the better for code enforcement?
So I mean, you know, for a long time we didn't see, people just couldn't adopt the energy code, or they just didn't have time to enforce it, or they didn't believe in it, or they didn't want to do it, or whatever the reasons. They didn't understand it enough. But you know, the state's done a great job of providing a lot of training and a lot of assistance, and I am seeing more and more jurisdictions moving forward and doing a better job. Everybody wants to do a good job. They just sometimes just don't have the resources or the abilities. And so I think that is changing. I am seeing an upswing. I am getting a lot of requests to move from really old codes to newer codes. And when I go out in the field, or I am helping people with their plan review, I'm definitely seeing a better understanding and a better quality install. And so jurisdictions are doing a really good job. And I also can see it in the questions that I get by email. I get a lot of questions on codes by email. And so when I get a question, like I got a bunch last week for some reason, everybody had energy code questions. And when I see them, I'm like, oh, that guy from that jurisdiction is asking me a question. That means he's really trying, and he's never given me questions before, right? And so you can really see a change, yes.
That's great. Another question for you. Where are we in the appeals process for IECC 2021? Where can we find more information?
Okay, so the IECC had a few appeals to it. You can find that information at iccsafe.org, and if you go to their code development page, you can see what's going on right now. All of the hearings finally ended. The last one ended Monday. So there were first original appeals where people filed their appeals. Some of it, like I said, against the EV charging and some of the electrification and the equipment efficiency changes and some other things that got appealed. They went through a committee and had online hearings. Then the ICC made recommendations, that committee made recommendations, and then it went to the board of directors. Those board of directors listened to everybody's plus the recommendations, and then they made their own recommendations. Many of the times they went with ICC or the appeals committee recommendations, but there were a couple of times where the board of directors of ICC made a completely different recommendation than the appeals committee. So it does good to look at those reports that are being posted. Plus, ICC's been sending those out. If you're a member, they've been sending those out regularly in updates.
Okay, great. Can you expand on the blower door testing requirements from 2015 to 2018 to 2021? Are there options for alternatives to mandatory blower testing? And what about the cost of blower door testing and the averages?
Okay, so I'm going to guess this is residential. So residential blower door testing has been a requirement in there for a long time. It hasn't really changed a lot from the 15 to the 18. It is mandatory. Some of the great changes that came in the 2021 actually for residential, because it did offer the option to say that, yeah, you still have to do a blower door test, but the amount is prescriptive. So whereas it was 3 air changes per hour, now if you go performance, you might be able to get 4 air changes per hour if you make it up somewhere else. So that is a little bit of an option. You can get a higher than prescriptive value as long as you make it up somewhere else and you still pass. So that came in. And then also another option that's in the 2021 that's great for blower doors for residential is that you have that option for the CFM per square foot. Blower doors, a lot of, the amount of volume you have in a home makes it easier to get to that ACH 50. The more volume you have, it's easier to meet that ACH 50. So if you have a smaller apartment or you have a smaller home, it's hard to get that ACH 50. You have to do more than a larger home to get that. And so the CFM per square foot makes it easier. And Robbie, I know, will talk more about this when he does his webinars, but so it makes it easier. So this allows those smaller homes and those apartments to have a better chance of meeting their blower door tests. So just those options, that's a lot better in the 2021. So even if I was going to adopt the 2018, I would bring in the language from the 2021 blower doors for residential. The cost, yeah, you know what, that changes everywhere I go. I could be in a place that's out in the middle of nowhere, there's not a person that has blower door equipment for miles around, and so it might be a higher cost than downtown Denver where there's somebody with equipment on every corner, So I see the costs ranging anywhere from, for a blower door, anywhere from $75 to $200. And so that's really hard to say on that, on cost of it. Are there options? In the 09, there was an option. You either did the table or you did the blower door, but it became mandatory to do the table and the blower door so that you didn't get to the blower door and not pass it and say, now what do I do? They gave you this roadmap to follow to get there so that you always passed if you did everything in the table. So you're supposed to do both. There used to be, some people would amend out if they were out in a real rural location, they would amend out the requirement for the blower door and just agree to do their inspections to that table. But you can't really do that right now, I don't think, because the code says the law says you can't amend the code to be less restrictive, so I'm not sure that that's a true option. I think if you're really looking for options, take the wording from the 2021, because that at least lets you have a higher rate if you can make it up somewhere else, and it lets you do the CFM per square foot.
Perfect. Yeah. And as Shauna said, Robbie Schwartz will be going a little bit more into depth on on January 13th in that webinar. So be sure to check that out. One last question for you, Shauna, and then we'll wrap up the webinar. Do you have any idea of the percentage increase of cost effectiveness when compared to IECC 2018?
Well, you know, everybody's got their numbers. I think the number is changing depending on what it really comes out from the appeals process and what they might take out. But my initial response after the hearings ended and after all of the online votes came in, I estimate between 8 and 10% increase in efficiency from the 18 to the 21. That's just just a gut thing. That's not any kind of true estimated. I haven't seen anybody come out with any numbers. I'm sure that the Energy Efficiency Codes Coalition or MBI or somebody has probably done some number crunching, but because the book isn't even published yet and the appeals weren't over, I don't think anybody could do a true evaluation. But I think you could see a significant increase in efficiency between, you know, required of all the ducts to be tested, requirement for commercial blower doors, requirement for commercial air barrier verification, just some of the different things that came out. I could see a bigger increase in efficiency, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think, is it the DOE that does the report for cost-effective analysis, and that usually comes out a few months after the code is adopted?
They usually will. They do the IR. They do the residential energy first, because there is no other resident. Well, right now there's not a lot of other residential energy codes, so they always do the residential energy first. Then they do ASHRAE 90.1. And so by the time, it's usually like next October or so, it's almost a year later from the codes to come out for them to do the IECC commercial.
Okay.
It'll be a while before we figure what that really is.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, I think those are all the questions that we have for today. I just want to thank Shauna for a great presentation, and for everyone that's that joined us today. Feel free to follow up with any questions that you may have, and please join us for the next few, for the rest of the webinar series. Hope to see you then.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end, Shauna.
Okay.